With just over a week remaining in the Trump administration, House Democrats are pushing forward with their plans to try to remove the president from power. They are voting tonight on a resolution calling on Vice President Pence to invoke Section 4 of the 25th Amendment. It would require a majority of the cabinet to approve a transfer of the president's powers to Mr. Pence. Sources tell CBS News he is unlikely to go along with that plan. If he does not, House Democrats plan to move forward with an article of impeachment charging President Trump with incitement of insurrection. Democrats argue Mr. Trump's repeated unfounded claims that the election was stolen and heated rhetoric during a rally just before the attack incited the violence on January 6th. At that rally near the White House, he urged his supporters in attendance to, quote, fight like hell. This morning, Maryland Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin, whose son died by suicide less than 2 weeks ago, pushed his Republican colleagues on the dire situation he sees in Washington and across the country right now.
Every court in the land that looked at it has rejected it. The state legislatures don't buy it. It's fine that Mr. Jordan wants to go back to it, but I think all of us should do some soul searching about 5 dead Americans, a Capitol police officer who's dead, dozens of people wounded, lots of our Capitol Hill cops in the hospitals, and a country on edge, and an inflamed right wing which thinks that we are on the verge of a civil war. Now, come on, guys. Can we get it together to act as a rules committee together as a Congress to tell the vice president simply to acknowledge what's obvious, which is this president is not up to the job for the next 8 days, and a lot of danger still faces us.
For his part, President Trump used his 8th day left in office to visit what he considers one of his signature achievements, the southern border wall. During his speech, he said he was not concerned of the removal talk and told his successor to be, quote, careful what you wish for.
The 25th Amendment is of zero risk to me, but will come back to haunt Joe Biden and the Biden administration. As the expression goes, be careful what you wish for. The impeachment hoax is a continuation of the greatest and most vicious witch hunt in the history of our country and is causing tremendous anger and division and pain, far greater than most people will ever understand, which is very dangerous for the USA, especially at this very tender time.
Democratic Congresswoman Cheri Bustos joins me now. She represents Illinois' 17th Congressional District. Congresswoman, thank you very much for being with us. First of all, tell us about your experiences last week, both during the attack on Capitol Hill and also what happened on your way back to Illinois.
Well, I was on the House floor the day that all of this unfolded, and I think it's important. You know, there's been, I want to praise the police officers who saved our lives. Literally, I think some members would not be here, members of Congress would not be here had it not been for the police officers who saved our lives. And I also want to do a shout out to journalists. I'm a former journalist myself, was for almost 2 decades of my life, that's what I did for a living. And it is literally, I have a member of Congress sitting to my left who leans over to me and he said, take a look at this. And he hands me his phone. And it shows people storming the steps of the Capitol. And I was alarmed by it. I said, when did this happen? And he said, this is live. And so much of that day, as it was unfolding, we were learning in real time because of the journalists who were covering this. And I think that's worth mentioning. But I was one of a handful of House Democrats on the floor. There were only to be 26 Democrats on the House floor that day. Those of us in leadership, I hold a leadership position. Those who were fighting the opposition to certifying the Electoral College vote. And then we had members of Congress in the gallery, which is typically reserved for people who observe what's going on the House floor. So my colleague, Eric Swalwell from California, showed me that. And it seemed like all of this was happening at the same time. The noise outside started getting louder and louder and felt closer and closer. Then we see Speaker Pelosi whisked out of she was at the dais. Then we see Leader Hoyer, our second highest ranking Democrat, then Jim Clyburn, our third highest ranking Democrat. They all have Secret Service or Capitol Police detail who help protect them. They were whisked out, and we were still there. Next thing we know, we're asked to be prepared to get on the floor. And then, I don't know, a little bit later, we were asked to put on a gas mask, be prepared to put on a gas mask. And, I mean, that is, where your mind goes during all of this. I think we were all in a different place. I kept thinking 2 steps ahead. What was I going to do? Could I help? There were a couple members of Congress around me who I wanted to make sure also could get out if that's what was going to happen. So just all of that going on, and just really, in the scheme of things, just a horrible, horrible day in our nation's history. I'm most proud of the fact that we went back into session and got the nation's work done that day.
Congresswoman, I want to thank you for those comments because I know a lot of my colleagues, I was just listening to their accounts of how harrowing and deathly afraid some of them were as they faced this crowd in order to document for the American people what was taking place. So I really appreciate that. But I do also want to ask you about that return trip to Illinois, because this is something that we're continuing to hear more about, is beyond Washington itself. It is not just obviously now confined to sort of within the Beltway at this one demonstration. Tell us about your experience on the way back, because this is what you and other lawmakers on both sides of the aisle seem to be experiencing, according to various accounts that are coming in.
Yeah, I've never seen anything like this. I'm serving in my 5th term right now, so I have flown hundreds of times between my Illinois and out here in Washington, D.C. I'm talking to you from my office in D.C. right now. Because I come from a smaller town, we have no direct flights. So typically I will fly through O'Hare Airport in Chicago. So it was on that first leg of my flight home after all of this mayhem and violence and rioting and destruction and hate. I was, after all of our votes were done, I flew home the next day, and we were literally somewhere, maybe we were over Ohio. It was somewhere between Washington, D.C. and the state of Illinois, where a woman sitting one row in front of me stands up as if it's a mini Trump rally. And there were MAGA hats all over. There were people who literally the day before were involved in this insurrection and the violence and the hate and the, really what potentially could have been even worse than it was. Even the fact that we've lost 5 lives, it could have been so much worse. She stands up, she pulls down her mask and yells out, "Patriots, patriots," and orders them to infiltrate the Republican Party at the county level. And in her words, like communists had invaded the Democratic Party. She and others on this plane, some at the top of their lungs, then went after another woman, called her a commie, talked about smothering babies. It was the most unusual thing. When you think about flying on an airplane, you have families, you have young people, you have people from all walks of lives. And this woman and those so many in the back of the plane as well, who felt that it was okay for them to start this rally in the middle of a flight, thousands of feet above ground. It got so bad that when we landed, the pilot came on and said that we could not deplane, that law enforcement had to come on the flight. So we waited for a little bit. Law enforcement came off, had to escort off one of these people that were involved in this yelling and disruption. And then after we deplaned and were outside of in the terminal, there was more yelling and arguing to the point where the Chicago police officers had to come running through the airport to respond to all of this. And so this is what is happening as a result of what was many years in the making, but culminated last Wednesday, January 6, 2021, and now is spilling out into these orders to go to state capitals all over the country, and then in the middle of a flight where many of us were just, all we were trying to do was get home or get to whatever our destination was.
So now, Congresswoman, you and others have called on President Trump to resign and for Vice President Mike Pence and the cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove him from office until inauguration next week. You know, as of now, as we've reported and other outlets have reported, that looks highly unlikely. Do you support a second impeachment? And what would you say to those who would argue that will only further to divide the country and, in fact, realistically, just logistically, is not feasible to really have an effect? So why bother now?
Well, what happened last week was, really a violation of our sacred democracy. It was a violation of our democracy, and this is about protecting our democracy. I have no bit of glee, nor do any members of Congress, in, first of all, asking for Vice President Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment, asking President Trump to resign, or now going through a second impeachment in President Trump's term. There's no delight in it, but this really is about preserving our democracy and sending a message that this can never happen again, this insurrection that was prompted by really just some horrible, horrible language that has been building over these last 4 years. My own background, I come from a district that Donald Trump won. I'm, one of a handful of Democrats in this entire country that come from a district that Donald Trump won. He won my congressional district that I serve in 2016, and he won it by even a greater margin in 2020. So this is, you've got the map there. This is considered downstate Illinois. I'm the only member in the Illinois congressional delegation in the House who's a Democrat outside of Chicagoland. And so, I understand if I want to look back to 2016 and people feeling that they hadn't been listened to and feel like they wanted to change and elected Donald Trump. I talked with many of those voters, many of whom then turned around, voted for Donald Trump and voted for me. I won by a 20-point margin in 2016 when he won the congressional district I served. But this is to the point where I see this as protecting our democracy and fighting for what is so sacred that we have to go back to the 1700s and our founding fathers. What was constructed as being so sacred, and that is, we're living in the longest serving democracy in the history of the world, and we've got to preserve that. Donald Trump has been a hindrance to what we hold so sacred.
Finally, Congresswoman, how concerned are you about security for the inauguration and beyond?
Well, we were briefed, members of Congress were briefed last night from the acting Sergeant at Arms, because the previous gentleman had to resign, and then also from the acting Chief of Capitol Police. We were briefed, and I believe it's come out now, so I'm not revealing anything that I shouldn't be talking about. But there's going to be 15,000 National Guardsmen and women here looking out for the public safety, for our safety. There's a new perimeter that is going up, fencing that is going up with razor wire on the top to protect the Capitol Hill complex. There will be people looking out for our safety, looking out for the public safety. And what happened on Wednesday can never happen again. We can never be unprepared. And frankly, again, I want to praise the rank and file police officers who saved my life, who saved our lives. It is the leadership that failed. These police officers failed us, and it could have been so much more deadly than it ended up being. But the rank and file police officers who, many of whom, we've got 15 who had to be hospitalized. Brian Sicknick has lost his life. A Capitol police officer. So we cannot be unprepared like this again. And that falls on the part of the leadership of law enforcement who failed their own officers and failed us as well.
Illinois Democratic Congresswoman Cheri Bustos. Congresswoman, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Elaine.